for instance, may or may not contrast biologically with ordinary males and females. So someone who's transgendered may or may not be biologically contrasting males and females. The term intersex, however, encompasses a group of conditions. I've mentioned these before: Klinefelter's, triple X syndrome, Turner syndrome, where there is a discrepancy between the external and internal genitals. And sometimes you can have both. You can have male external organs and a uterus. These are things that actually exist. And what do you call this person in terms of gender? They are intersex. They have both male and female organs. So what does society choose to call that person in terms of gender? Well, that's a cultural decision to be made. Self-identified transgendered people are extremely diverse. Some individuals' gender identity may contradict with the biological sex that they were born with, or maybe they have a gender category that was ascribed to them that they choose not to adhere to during infancy. And this is especially true with intersex individuals. And gender categories are also malleable and changeable cross-culturally and historically. So, for instance, in your book talks about the Hijras, which were a third sex of castrated men in India who filled specific roles. Also, in Brazil, there's a third gender represented by men dressed as women, transvestitism. That it's a third relationship in Brazil, third gender role or gender attribution in Brazil, where they have a very binary view of things, but there's actually this third category as well. And the transgender category encompasses a variety of persons whose gender, performance, and identity contradict or defy a basic binary gender structure. Now, this is all different. This is how you identify. This is what your identity is, and in terms of culture. And so this has nothing to do with your sexual attraction to other people. This is just how you identify yourselves. So you could identify yourself as a anthropology professor. That's part of my identity, right? That's how I identify myself. But I also identify myself as a man. But that has nothing to do with your another category, which is your sexual orientation. And sexual orientation refers to a person's habitual sexual attraction to and sexual activities with persons of the opposite sex, which would be heterosexuality, the same sex, which is homosexuality, both sexes, which is bisexuality, or asexuality, which is a indifference towards or lack of attraction to members of either sex. And to some extent, all human activities, including sexual preferences, are to some extent learned. So you grow into these roles, and they're malleable and at least partially socially, culturally constructed. And the norms that exist are also culturally variable across time and through between cultures as well. And so what we think of as appropriate or moral sexual behavior may not be the same in a cultural relativistic perspective. To give you a sort of an extreme example, your book talks about, for instance, the Azande, where boys apprentice with older warriors with whom they have sexual relationships. And so this is actually something that has occurred in multiple times in multiple places across history. So we historically know about the ancient Greeks. The highest form of love was considered to be between a male teacher and his boy student, and that doesn't mean that they didn't have wives and that they didn't have home lives with their families, but part of that relationship between teacher and pupil was in part sexual as well. This would be a crime in our own culture today. This would be inappropriate to many people today. But once again, there is a variety of human experiences. One that might be quite shocking to you, in fact, that's described in your book is from Papua New Guinea, the Itoro community in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, that was studied in the late 1960s, and it's an unusual but interesting case where the Itoro men had a belief system that they thought that semen was necessary to give a life force to a fetus. So, but the problem is that men only have a certain amount of semen. They only have a limited amount of this life force. And so when you have sex, you're sapping the life out of the adult man. So any sex act depletes this supply of life force and saps male virility. So you lose your masculinity as you have sex. So heterosexual sex is necessary to have children. That's understood. You need that to reproduce, but it's unpleasant because it would lead to a man's eventual death. But so heterosexual sex amongst the Itoro was limited and discouraged, except for about 100 days a year under certain circumstances within only in the woods far from the village. And so you didn't want it even taking place near your village. But although heterosexual sex was discouraged, and so sex between males and females was discouraged and limited, homosexual sex between males was viewed as essential. Because where do you get this life force? So the Itoro believed that boys could not produce semen on their own. They needed to orally receive semen from adult males in order to grow into full men. So these homosexual acts were of boys filleting adult males, receiving their semen, was not taboo. This was not forbidden. It was absolutely necessary for a boy to become a man. It was not considered unmasculine or feminine in any way, or even really inappropriate. So homosexual sex in this sense between older men and younger boys was seen as absolutely essential. Whereas homosexual sex between boys of the same age, because they weren't receiving semen from one another, was discouraged as well. So this is a ritualized homosexuality, and there are many tribes that have been observed, especially in Papua New Guinea, that practice this sort of ritualized homosexuality. So there is a lot of flexibility in our sexual expressions that require you to understand the cultural context in which you find these practices. And so if you were to see the practices of the Itoro men and place it into our own way of thinking, it would be beyond anything that we could call legal or appropriate. But in the belief system of the Itoro, it's absolutely essential. And so this is where I've talked about this in the past, that these chapters that we're looking at you're taking gender out of the culture, looking at it as a specific thing that you were microscopically looking at, but you have to fit it back into that culture to see how it fits together into that tapestry. So gender is not something that is universal. It is something that fits into a pattern. So your family structure, your identity, your socioeconomics, your sociopolitics, your religion, your interactions with other communities. All of these things are factors weighing into the construction of culture, and gender is part of that everybody has. Thanks very much.